What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question nobody dares to ask. How did one woman literally control the Vatican for decades? Forget everything you think you know about medieval politics, because the real story behind Marozia is way more twisted than any Netflix series you've binged. We're talking about a woman who didn't just influence popes. She made them, unmade them, and according to some historians, even murdered them when they got out of line. Smash that like button if you want the raw, unfiltered truth about the most powerful woman you've never heard of. And let me know in the comments how far you think human ambition can actually go. Because Marozia didn't just break glass ceilings. She shattered the entire cathedral. Picture this. It's 10th century Rome, and the most powerful position in the Western world isn't held by an emperor or a king. It's controlled by a woman whose very name became synonymous with corruption, scandal, and political genius. Marozia of Tusculum didn't just live through what historians call the Pornocracy. She was the Pornocracy. And before you ask, yes, that's the actual historical term for this period. But here's what's going to blow your mind. Everything you learned in school about the medieval church being this untouchable, holy institution, total fantasy. Because for nearly 50 years, the papacy was basically Marozia's personal chess game, and every pope was just another piece she moved around the board. And when they stopped being useful, well, let's just say medieval Rome had some very creative ways of dealing with inconvenient popes. So buckle up, because this story involves murder, incest, political manipulation, and enough family drama to make the Borgias look like a wholesome sitcom. And it all starts with a teenage girl who figured out that in a world where men held all the official power, the real power lay in controlling those men. In this part, you'll discover why Marozia's childhood reads like a masterclass in medieval realpolitik, and it's absolutely terrifying. Born around 890 CE into the Theophylact family, Marozia didn't just grow up in Rome's political elite. She grew up in the family that basically owned the papacy like it was their personal franchise. Her father, Theophylact, was a Roman senator who treated popes like employees. Her mother, Theodora the Elder, was described by contemporary chroniclers as having ruled Rome like an empress, and that's not a compliment coming from 10th century monks. This woman allegedly had affairs with multiple popes and used her influence to place her lovers on the papal throne. So, yeah, Marozia learned corruption at her mother's knee. But here's where it gets really twisted. Marozia's first major political move happened when she was probably around 15 years old. Pope Sergius III, who was already in his 60s, became completely infatuated with this teenage girl. And according to the Liber Pontificalis, contemporary records, and later historical accounts, their relationship produced a son. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think a 15-year-old girl seducing a pope sounds like victim blaming, because you'd be absolutely right. What we're really looking at here is a teenage girl being groomed and exploited by one of the most powerful men in Europe. But here's what makes Marozia's story so complex. She somehow turned this exploitation into the foundation of her own power. That son? His name was John, and he would later become Pope John V. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because first, Marozia had to survive long enough to see her political investments pay off. And in 10th century Rome, that was no guarantee. Political opponents had this nasty habit of ending up dead in the Tiber River, and Marozia's family had just as many enemies as they had allies. The teenage Marozia quickly learned that in Rome's political landscape, you were either predator or prey, and she decided very early which one she was going to be. Contemporary accounts describe her as stunningly beautiful, intellectually sharp, and absolutely ruthless. Basically, she was every medieval patriarch's worst nightmare, a woman who understood the game better than they did. You thought that was bad? Wait until you hear how Marozia turned papal politics into her personal puppet show. By her early 20s, she had already proven that she could make or break the careers of the most powerful men in Christendom, and she was just getting started. Her first major power play came through her marriage to Alberic I, Margrave of Spoleto. Now, medieval marriages were basically political treaties with wedding rings, but Marozia turned this one into something much more sophisticated. Alberic brought military power to the relationship, but Marozia brought something far more valuable. She knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, in Roman politics. Together, they effectively controlled who sat on the throne of St. Peter. Between 914 and 928 CE, a parade of popes rose and fell according to Marozia's whims. Pope John X, for example, initially enjoyed her support because he was useful in consolidating power. But the moment he started showing too much independence, Marozia orchestrated his downfall. Here's how it worked. John X tried to assert actual papal authority over Rome's nobility. Big mistake. In 928, Marozia had him imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he mysteriously died. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but considering John X was a healthy man in his prime who died shortly after crossing Marozia, let's just say medieval natural causes were often suspiciously convenient. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. After eliminating John X, Marozia installed 2 consecutive puppet popes who barely lasted a year each. Pope Leo VI died after 7 months, and Pope Stephen VII managed 8 months before he too succumbed to natural causes. The pattern was becoming clear. Cross Marozia, die mysteriously, serve her interests, live comfortably. It was a simple system, and it worked beautifully. By this point, every cardinal, bishop, and political player in Rome understood the new rules of the game. The Vatican wasn't being run by divine providence anymore. It was being run by a woman who had figured out that fear was more reliable than faith. This is where everything escalates to absolutely insane levels, and I mean that literally. In 931 CE, Marozia pulled off what might be the most audacious political maneuver in papal history. She installed her own illegitimate son, remember John, the kid she allegedly had with Pope Sergius III, as Pope John the Feckings. Pause and think. Would you have the sheer audacity to make your own child the head of the Catholic Church? Because that's exactly what Marozia did, and she made it look easy. John V became Pope when he was barely in his 20s, which tells you everything you need to know about how this appointment worked. This wasn't about spiritual calling or theological expertise. This was about keeping the papacy in the family business. And it worked perfectly, at least initially. With her son on the papal throne, Marozia reached the absolute peak of her power. She controlled the Vatican through blood ties, which was infinitely more reliable than political alliances. Every major decision that came out of the Holy See went through her first. Bishops were appointed or removed based on her recommendations. Church policy was essentially Marozia policy. But here's where human nature gets complicated. Having her son as pope also created new vulnerabilities. John V was young, inexperienced, and completely dependent on his mother for guidance. This made him an effective puppet, but it also made him a target for everyone who opposed Marozia's rule. Contemporary chroniclers like Liutprand of Cremona wrote that during this period, all things in Rome were done according to her will and judgment. Translation: Marozia wasn't just influencing the church. She was the church's temporal authority. The Vatican had effectively become a subsidiary of the Theophylact family corporation. And the craziest part? This arrangement lasted for years without any serious challenge. Why? Because Marozia had created a system where everyone who mattered was either terrified of her, financially dependent on her, or both. She had successfully weaponized the papacy. Plot twist incoming, and this one's going to completely flip the script on everything we've covered so far. Just when Marozia seemed untouchable, she made a decision that would ultimately bring down her entire empire. And it all started with what seemed like another brilliant political marriage. In 932, Marozia's husband Alberic V died, leaving her a widow at the height of her power. Now, a lesser politician might have played it safe, maybe married another reliable Italian nobleman. But Marozia wasn't a lesser politician. She was a visionary who always thought 3 moves ahead. So she set her sights on the biggest prize in Europe, King Hugh of Italy. Hugh was essentially the closest thing to an emperor that Italy had at the time. Marrying him would have given Marozia legitimate royal authority to go along with her de facto control of the papacy. It would have been the ultimate power couple of medieval Europe, and together they could have reshaped the entire political landscape. Here's where things get really wild. The marriage negotiations involved Hugh promising to help Marozia extend her influence beyond Rome to control other major Italian cities. We're talking about a plan to create essentially a papal royal dynasty that would have controlled both spiritual and temporal authority across the Italian peninsula. But, and this is a massive but, Marozia had forgotten something crucial in her calculations. She had a son from her first marriage, Alberic II, who was now a teenager and had been watching his mother's political maneuvering his entire life. And Alberic II had learned those lessons a little too well. Let me know in the comments. When you're planning the ultimate power grab, do you think about how it might threaten your own children? Because Marozia apparently didn't, and that oversight was about to cost her everything. The wedding between Marozia and Hugh took place in 932, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Marozia had pulled off the impossible. She was now connected to royal authority, her son was pope, and her political network extended across Italy. She had effectively created a shadow empire with herself at its center. But her teenage son, Alberic II, was watching all of this, and he was making some very dangerous calculations of his own. Before we continue, could something like this happen today? Comment below, because what happens next is basically a medieval version of a corporate takeover, and it's absolutely ruthless. Alberic II had spent his entire life watching his mother manipulate popes, eliminate rivals, and accumulate power. And he had learned that in the Theophylact family business, there was only room for one person at the top. Marozia's marriage to Hugh wasn't just a political alliance. It was a direct threat to Alberic's own future. Here's what Alberic figured out. His mother's new husband, Hugh, had his own sons and his own political agenda. Once Hugh consolidated power in Rome, there would be no guarantee that Alberic would inherit anything from the empire his mother had built. In fact, Hugh's sons might very well eliminate him as a potential rival. So in 932, just months after Marozia's wedding, Alberic X orchestrated what can only be described as a family coup, and the way he did it was pure political genius. Alberic rallied the Roman nobility by appealing to their xenophobia and wounded pride. Hugh was a foreigner, he argued, and Rome was being ruled by outsiders who didn't understand Roman traditions. This was masterful propaganda because it was technically true, Hugh was from northern Italy, but it ignored the fact that Marozia's family had been controlling Rome for decades. The rebellion came to a head during a banquet at the Castel Sant'Angelo. According to contemporary accounts, Alberic had arranged for his supporters to storm the feast and demand Hugh's expulsion from Rome. When Hugh tried to assert his authority, Alberic's men literally threw him out of the city. But here's the really shocking part. Alberic didn't just exile his stepfather, he imprisoned his own mother. Marozia, the woman who had controlled popes and manipulated kings, found herself locked in the same Castel Sant'Angelo where she had imprisoned Pope John X. The irony was probably not lost on her, but she was powerless to do anything about it. Her son had used her own methods against her, and he had done it perfectly. If you're as shocked as I was reading this, hit that like button, because this family drama makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. With Marozia imprisoned and Hugh in exile, Alberic II declared himself Prince and Senator of all Romans. And just like that, 50 years of carefully constructed female power vanished overnight. But Alberic wasn't done dismantling his mother's legacy. Remember Pope John V, Marozia's son, who was still technically running the Vatican? Alberic basically turned his half-brother into a ceremonial figurehead. John V could perform religious ceremonies and handle spiritual matters, but all temporal authority now flowed through Alberic. This was political neutering on an unprecedented scale. The papacy, which had been the source of Marozia's power, was reduced to a religious office with no real political influence. Alberic had effectively separated church and state by keeping his family in control of both but making sure the state clearly dominated the church. Contemporary chroniclers record that John the Eighth died in 935, though whether from natural causes or more mysterious circumstances remains unclear. What we do know is that his death removed one of the last links to Marozia's power structure. The woman who had once made popes was now watching her carefully constructed empire disappear piece by piece. And Marozia herself? She spent the final years of her life as a prisoner in her own former stronghold. The records show she died in captivity sometime around 937, though the exact circumstances of her death remain unknown. Some historians suggest she was murdered. Others believe she died of natural causes brought on by the stress of imprisonment. Let me know in the comments. Who's the real villain here? The mother who built an empire through manipulation and possibly murder, or the son who destroyed that empire to save himself? What's particularly tragic, or poetic, depending on your perspective, is that Marozia's downfall came from her greatest success. She had taught her son too well. Alberic II had learned every lesson about political survival, manipulation, and the ruthless pursuit of power. And when the time came, he applied those lessons against the teacher. Take a second to process what we've just covered, because the implications of Marozia's rise and fall extend far beyond one family's power struggle. Her story represents a fundamental shift in how the medieval church operated, and the changes she initiated lasted for centuries. Alberic II ruled Rome for 22 years after imprisoning his mother, and during that time he completely restructured the relationship between papal and secular authority. Never again would a single family wield the kind of unchecked power that Marozia had accumulated. But ironically, Alberic's reforms were only possible because his mother had already demonstrated how easily the papacy could be controlled. Here's where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. Marozia's methods became the template for political manipulation of the church for the next several centuries. The Borgia family, for example, used remarkably similar tactics in the Renaissance. The main difference was that they were more subtle about it and learned from Marozia's mistakes. The period of Marozia's dominance, roughly 904 to 932, fundamentally changed papal politics. Before her, popes at least maintained the pretense of spiritual independence. After her, everyone understood that the papacy was ultimately a political office that could be bought, sold, or inherited like any other position of power. But let's be clear about something. Marozia didn't corrupt the papacy. She revealed corruption that was already there. The church had been deeply involved in temporal politics for centuries before she was born. What she did was make that involvement explicit and unapologetic. Contemporary sources from across Europe show that Marozia's reputation spread far beyond Rome. Kings and emperors knew her name and feared her influence. The fact that a woman could wield such power in a male-dominated world was seen as either miraculous or demonic, depending on whose interests she served. Real talk. Does this remind you of anything happening today? Let me know below, because the dynamics of power, corruption, and institutional control that Marozia mastered are still playing out in modern politics and religious institutions. This is where everything falls apart for the traditional narrative about medieval women being powerless victims of circumstance. Because whatever else you can say about Marozia, and there's plenty to say, she was nobody's victim. She was a political operator who understood power better than most of the men around her. Modern historians have had to completely reevaluate the period known as the Pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, because those terms were invented by hostile male chroniclers who couldn't accept that women could be effective political leaders. The sexualized language was designed to delegitimize female power by reducing it to sexual manipulation. But when you strip away the misogynistic rhetoric and look at actual political outcomes, Marozia's track record is remarkable. She maintained stability in Rome during a period of enormous political upheaval. She successfully managed complex international relationships, and she created a power structure that lasted for decades. Letters discovered in Vatican archives reveal that during Marozia's period of influence, papal administration was actually more efficient than it had been under previous male-dominated regimes. Church finances were better managed, and diplomatic relationships with other European powers were more stable. This doesn't excuse the murders, the corruption, or the blatant nepotism, but it does force us to ask uncomfortable questions about how we evaluate historical figures based on gender. Male rulers who used identical tactics are often praised as strong leaders or political realists. Marozia is remembered as a scandalous seductress. According to records from the Lateran archive, several contemporary rulers actually sought Marozia's advice on political matters. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII corresponded with her about church policy. The King of France consulted her on papal appointments that affected French interests. These weren't the actions of rulers dealing with a mere courtesan or political novelty. They were treating Marozia as a legitimate power broker whose decisions had real consequences across Europe. She had effectively become an unofficial head of state, and other heads of state recognized her authority. Before we continue to the final revelations, could someone like Marozia seize power in a modern religious institution? Comment your take, because the methods she used aren't as outdated as you might think. Let's pause here and think about what Marozia's story actually teaches us about power, corruption, and institutional control. Because stripped of all the medieval trappings, this is fundamentally a story about how institutions can be captured by individuals who understand their weaknesses better than their defenders do. Marozia succeeded because she recognized that the papacy's claims to spiritual authority were undermined by its dependence on temporal support. Popes needed military protection, financial backing, and political alliances to maintain their position. She simply made herself indispensable to providing those things. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Whether we're talking about corporate boardrooms, political parties, or religious organizations, institutions are vulnerable to capture by individuals who control the resources those institutions need to survive. Marozia just did it first, and did it better than anyone before or since. But here's what makes her story particularly relevant to modern audiences. She succeeded by exploiting the gap between an institution's public image and its private reality. The Church claimed to be above worldly concerns, but it was desperately dependent on worldly support. Marozia made that dependence explicit and used it to her advantage. Contemporary account from the Chronicle of Benedict of Montserrat describe how Marozia's political network extended beyond Rome to include bishops, abbots, and secular rulers across Italy. She had essentially created a shadow government that operated through existing institutional structures while serving her personal interests. This wasn't crude bribery or simple corruption. This was sophisticated institutional capture that required understanding complex relationships between religious authority, political power, and economic interests. Marozia had to master canon law, diplomatic protocol, military strategy, and financial management to maintain her position. The fact that she succeeded for nearly 30 years proves that she wasn't just lucky or purely opportunistic. She was a strategic thinker who adapted her methods as circumstances changed and who built systems that could survive temporary setbacks. And here's the really scary part. Most of her contemporaries probably never fully understood how completely she had captured the system. They saw individual appointments, specific policy decisions, and particular political outcomes. But they missed the overall pattern of institutional control that made all of those individual actions possible. Here's the question that historians have been debating for over 1,000 years. Was Marozia a genius who exposed institutional hypocrisy, or was she a destructive force who damaged the credibility of Christianity itself? And honestly, the answer is probably both. On one hand, Marozia's legacy includes a more realistic understanding of how religious institutions actually function. The idea that spiritual authority can be completely separated from temporal power was always a fiction, and she made that fiction impossible to maintain. In that sense, she performed a valuable service by forcing the Church to confront its own contradictions. But on the other hand, the cynicism about papal authority that Marozia's actions created had lasting consequences. The Protestant Reformation, the rise of secular government, and the decline of church influence in Europe all trace their roots back to scandals like the ones Marozia orchestrated. When Martin Luther wrote about papal corruption in the 16th century, he was drawing on a tradition of criticism that began with chroniclers describing Marozia's reign. The idea that popes could be bought, sold, and manipulated wasn't a Protestant invention. It was a historical fact that people like Marozia had made undeniable. Here's what we know for certain. Marozia changed the course of European history. The papacy never fully recovered the kind of unquestioned authority it had claimed before her rise to power. Every subsequent pope had to operate in a world where everyone knew that papal authority could be compromised. But perhaps more importantly, Marozia proved that exceptional individuals could reshape institutions that seemed permanent and unchangeable. She demonstrated that power structures that appeared divinely ordained were actually human constructions that could be manipulated by humans who understood their weaknesses. The records show that even her enemies respected her abilities. Liutprand of Cremona, who despised everything Marozia represented, described her as a woman of extraordinary intelligence and political skill. That's not the language you use to describe someone whose power was based purely on sexual manipulation or lucky circumstances. What do you think? Was Marozia a genius or completely insane? Let me know below, because this is one of those historical questions that says as much about our own values as it does about medieval politics. So here we are at the final revelation, and it's time to answer the question we started with. How exactly did Marozia bring the Vatican to its knees? Because the answer isn't what you might expect. Marozia didn't destroy the Vatican through her scandals. She destroyed the myth of papal infallibility that the Vatican had spent centuries constructing. Before her, people could at least pretend that popes were chosen by divine providence and guided by spiritual considerations. After her, everyone knew that papal politics were just politics with better costumes. The real scandal wasn't the murders, the nepotism, or even the fact that she controlled multiple popes. The real scandal was that she made it impossible to ignore how mundane and human the supposedly divine institution actually was. She pulled back the curtain on the ultimate authority figure in medieval Europe and revealed a very ordinary political operation. This is why her story was so threatening to church authorities that they tried to bury it under layers of misogynistic propaganda. They couldn't deny that she had controlled the papacy, so they tried to reduce her to a sexual caricature. But the political facts remained. For nearly 30 years, the most important decisions in Western Christianity went through a woman who answered to no earthly authority. The Vatican survived Marozia's control, obviously, but it never fully recovered from the legitimacy crisis she created. Every subsequent scandal, every future corruption case, every challenge to papal authority could point back to Marozia as proof that the Church was fundamentally a human institution with human weaknesses. And here's the ultimate irony. By trying to erase her from history, the Church actually made her more powerful. Her story became a weapon that critics could use against papal claims of divine authority. The more the Church insisted that such corruption was impossible, the more damaging the historical evidence became. Historical records from across Europe show that kings and emperors stopped treating papal pronouncements as automatically authoritative after Marozia's period of control. They had seen how easily papal authority could be manipulated, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. The scandal that brought the Vatican to its knees wasn't any specific crime Marozia committed. It was the revelation that the entire system could be captured and controlled by someone who understood its weaknesses. She proved that institutional authority is only as strong as people's willingness to believe in it. Drop your verdict below, hero, villain, or something in between, because Marozia's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and the institutions we trust. She showed that even the most sacred authorities are ultimately human constructions, and that means they can be deconstructed by humans who are smart enough, ruthless enough, and patient enough to do the work. And maybe that's the most scandalous revelation of all, that there's nothing divine about divine authority except our willingness to believe in it. Marozia knew that. Her enemies knew that. And now you know it too.